A U.S. warship seizes an Iranian vessel moving toward the Gulf of Oman. Oil jumps, stocks fall, and the ceasefire everyone keeps talking about suddenly starts looking like a story. The market no longer believes that is the scene that matters, because the real story is not the ship by itself. The real story is that Iran is trying to force the world to see something Washington does not want the world to see clearly. The physical system and the paper system are not the same thing. That is the warning. And that is why this moment is more dangerous than it looks. If this were only a military story, the language would be familiar. A blockade, a seizure, some retaliation, some drone strikes, more escalation, more statements, more talk about resolve. Great powers know how to speak that language. They can stay inside it for months. But Iran is trying to move the war out of that box. It is not only threatening ships, it is threatening the relationship between real energy choke points and the financial credibility of the American system. It is saying, in effect, you can call treasuries safe all day long, but the world still runs on physical oil, moving through physical routes, and those routes are now under pressure. That is a much bigger battlefield. I want to give you one framework for understanding this. The physical paper split, America rules through paper power, treasuries, reserve currency status, debt markets, global demand for dollar assets. The ability to issue claims on future stability because the world still believes U.S. paper sits at the center of the system. Iran's leverage is physical, oil, maritime choke points, shipping risk, insurance risk, refining risk, the ability to make real barrels harder, slower, and more expensive to move. Most of the time, paper power looks stronger. That is because normality protects it. As long as ships move, as long as crude flows, as long as inflation stays calm, as long as the Fed still has room, the financial system can keep pretending that paper claims and physical reality move together. But choke point wars expose the hierarchy. When routes shake, the physical comes first. You cannot fuel Europe with confidence. You cannot run aviation on sentiment. You cannot stabilize freight, food, tourism, and industrial transport with a treasury auction. You still need oil. That is the heart of Iran's message. And this is why the ship seizure matters so much. The market understood immediately that this was not only about one vessel. It was about the price of every future barrel moving through a zone where political risk, military risk, and insurance risk are all rising together. That is why crude jumps so fast once oil rises in the middle of an already fragile inflation environment. Washington has a bigger problem than a naval confrontation. It has a timing problem. The U.S. system right now needs lower inflation, easier financing conditions, and more confidence in the bond market. That is the only comfortable setting for a government trying to manage large issuance without turning treasury financing into the story. Iran can see that. That is why its warning is not random propaganda. It is aimed at the exact point where the American system is already vulnerable. If energy stays elevated, inflation pressure stays alive. If inflation pressure stays alive, rate cuts get harder. If rate cuts get harder, debt rollover becomes more dangerous. If debt rollover becomes more dangerous, faith in paper starts to thin out. That is the chain. And that is why the IMF warning matters. Most people will treat it like background noise. I think that is a mistake. If the safe haven premium on treasuries is weakening, if investors are no longer giving U.S. debt the same automatic psychological advantage it once had, then war-linked inflation is not just an energy problem. It becomes a financing problem. That gets worse if the Treasury has pushed too much issuance toward the short end, because then the whole system is making one giant hidden bet. It is betting that short-term rates will come down. It is betting that inflation will cool. It is betting that the physical world will calm down in time to save the paper world. Iran sees that bet, and it is trying to attack the bet without ever needing to defeat America in a conventional sense. That is the sophistication here. Iran is not saying it can outgun the United States. It is saying it can force the United States to defend a paper empire against physical vulnerabilities, and that is much harder. Now, widen the map Hormuz alone is enough to shake the system, but the danger grows because Iran's leverage does not stop there. The moment Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea enter the same strategic conversation, This stops being a Gulf disruption story and becomes a wider global transport story that matters. Because once flows are rerouted or compressed through fewer lanes, every downstream node becomes more valuable and more fragile. Pipelines matter more, receiving terminals matter more, pumping stations matter more, insurance spreads matter more, refining schedules matter more. That is why the jet fuel issue matters. It is not a side story. It is a signal that product balances can start breaking before policymakers are emotionally ready for them to break. Once aviation, shipping, tourism, and industrial logistics begin feeling the same squeeze, the war leaves the Middle East in people's minds. It becomes a global inflation story, and democratic governments lose room very quickly once wars become inflation stories. That is especially true for Washington now because it is boxed in. If it tightens the blockade harder, oil pressure rises, inflation risk rises, and the Treasury problem gets worse. If it eases off, Iran proves that chokepoint leverage works. If it widens the war to solve the problem permanently, then the China question moves to the center. And that may be the most dangerous branch of all, because more and more people in Washington are saying openly what used to remain implied. Maybe the real target is not only Iran, maybe the deeper logic is China cut Beijing off from Iranian oil, raise Chinese energy costs, disrupt Chinese trade through the Gulf. Turn Middle Eastern pressure into a China strategy on paper. I understand the temptation. In reality, I think it is reckless because Washington keeps making the same mistake. It keeps treating China as if it were isolated. China is not isolated. Every serious attempt to squeeze Beijing's energy position creates a stronger incentive for Russia and China to integrate faster. Every effort to restrict Chinese access to Gulf energy makes Russian substitution more valuable. Every extra layer of pressure teaches Eurasian powers the same lesson: root around the American system while you still can. That is the strategic self-harm built into this approach. Washington thinks it is raising the price for its adversaries. It may actually be accelerating their consolidation. And if that happens, the war produces two outcomes at once. In the short term, America absorbs inflation stress, debt stress, and market stress. In the medium term, America accelerates de-dollarization habits, alternative settlement systems, and a wider appetite for anything that reduces dependence on US. Controlled financial plumbing, this is how empires accidentally train the world to lead them. Not by disappearing, by weaponizing their advantages so aggressively that everyone else starts building exits. That is why I would not dismiss Iran's warning. Yes, it is political theater, but it is theater anchored to a real structural vulnerability. The US system still depends on a world where paper trust and physical flows remain aligned. Chokepoint wars attack that alignment. They push inflation higher, complicate rates, make debt management harder, weak and safe, Haven psychology, and remind the world that there is still no paper substitute for real barrels moving through real maritime corridors. Once that lesson becomes visible, the real question is no longer whether America can seize another ship. Of course it can. The real question is whether it can protect the pricing logic of its own paper empire while the physical world moves against it. That is much harder. So how does this end? There are really only three paths. The first is that Washington doubles down, tightens enforcement, and tries to break Iran before the financial consequences become politically intolerable. That is the clean fantasy, but it assumes the physical system will stay obedient long enough for the paper system to survive the stress. I think that is a dangerous assumption. The second is that Washington starts looking quietly for an off-ramp and then rebrands partial de-escalation as prudence, discipline, or strategic success that lowers immediate pressure. But it also tells the region that Iran found the right lever. The third is that the anti-Iran logic broadens into an anti-China logic, and then the war becomes much bigger, much messier, and much harder to control. Not because China collapses, but because Russia backfills, Beijing adapts, and the rest of the world adjusts even faster to a future with less faith in US paper dominance. I still think the second path is the most likely, not because Washington is wise, because arithmetic eventually beats rhetoric. Oil is real, inflation is real, debt rollover is real, treasury demand is real. If the war keeps pressing on all four at once, then the US system eventually has to choose between strategic pride and financial stability. Great powers usually posture toward pride until the last possible moment, then they retreat toward stability and invent a new story about why retreat was always strategic. That is the pattern I see here. The real danger is not that Iran wins some cinematic military victory. The real danger is that it demonstrates something much more corrosive, that a weaker state sitting next to real energy choke points can force the strongest financial power in the world to defend not just ships and alliances, but the pricing credibility of its own paper system. And once that lesson is visible, everybody learns from it, markets learn from it, governments learn from it, China learns from it, Russia learns from it, Europe learns from it. The developing world learns from it. They learn that treasuries are still central, but no longer untouchable. They learn that energy routes can still discipline finance. They learn that wars sold as regional containment can become global confidence tests. And they learn that Washington may still be powerful enough to dominate headlines, but not powerful enough to keep the material foundations of its own system outside the war. That is why this is a fatal warning, not because America collapses tomorrow, because the logic is cumulative. Every extra week of war raises costs. Every extra spike in oil raises inflation pressure. Every extra inflation scare raises rate pressure. Every extra rates problem raises debt pressure. Every extra debt problem raises faith pressure. Strong systems are rarely broken by one dramatic strike. They are weakened by repeated moments when reality keeps forcing the paper to reprice. That is what Iran is trying to do. Now, not defeat America head on, force America to defend the paper value of its empire against the physical vulnerabilities of the world it still depends on. That is a much bigger war than most people think they are watching.